One of the things that has made this so difficult for businesses who are trying to operate in this space is it really is impossible to predict because it is entirely up to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
There is no consistent framework that you can use looking at that list of countries. To begin with, some countries engage really constructively, some countries basically didn't engage at all.
Let's look at Donald Trump's tariffs. Now, the EU has reacted with shock after Trump threatened to impose 30% tariffs on virtually all imports from the EU starting on August the 1st. The EU and the US were expecting to agree a 10% tariff, but following Donald Trump's surprise announcement yesterday, Chief Ursula von der Leyen threatened to take proportionate countermeasures if needed. The French President Emmanuel Macron said that the EU should be ready for a trade war, but other European leaders have called for calm. Speaking to Fox News last night, Donald Trump said that some countries were very upset now, but he insisted the tariffs meant hundreds of billions of dollars were pouring in.
The trade thing is going to be very big, and we're sending out letters as we speak. And it's basically telling countries that we are going to give you the privilege to shop and work in our country. And I think it's very good. And in some cases, we'll make deals. You know, we'll make a direct deal as opposed to a letter. Some of the countries are very upset now because they've been taking advantage of us for 30, 40 years.
Well, let's now speak with Dmitry Grozoubinski, who's a former trade negotiator and diplomat, and he's also founder of the consultancy Explain Trade, which does exactly what it says on the tin. Dmitry, welcome.
Good to be with you.
So tell us what's kind of happened here, because you know, the EU was hoping for a kind of a landing zone of about 10%, and Donald Trump has come out at 30%. What's happened?
So as late as Friday, what people seem to think might be happening is that the EU had been willing to accept the US maintaining a 10% tariff, and that a deal was about to happen where the EU would tell the US, okay, you can have a 10% tariff on us, and we promise not to retaliate, with a few little things sprinkled on top of that, and both sides would declare victory. What it seems like actually happened is that might have been the vibe in the room, that might have been what they were hearing from US officials, but the US president wasn't sold or changed his mind, and so instead of a deal, we got a letter from the US president saying that as of August 1st, the EU will be hit with tariffs that are even higher than those he levied on Liberation Day in April.
Gosh, so what were they before in terms of before they went up to 30%?
So they were. This is a long journey now. U.S. tariffs before Donald Trump tended to average, 2-3%. On Liberation Day, he initially introduced a 10% tariff and an additional 20% tariff, but he almost immediately withdrew or suspended the 20% part of that. So they went back down to 10%, and now he's saying they're going up to 30% again.
And how is this going to affect the EU? Tell us about some of the kind of products and kind of sectors that could be affected.
Well, it's a macro drain on the EU economy. The kind of sectors we're talking about is everything from agricultural and manufactured foods to pharmaceuticals, the car industry, of course. There's a huge amount of trade in what trade wongs call sort of machine goods and machinery. A lot of that is the things that US factories need. So components and machines that go into US factories or go into products made in the United States, and so on.
And just remind us of where the UK has ended up on tariffs.
So on Liberation Day, the UK was hit with just a 10% tariff because the formula the US used looked at the trade deficit the US has with a country, and it didn't have one with the UK. The UK buys more goods from the US than the other way around. So it got hit with a 10% tariff. But it also very soon thereafter got hit with high tariffs on cars and steel, as did everyone. And now the UK and US have done a deal where that 10% tariff remains, but the UK has received a generous quota for its cars at just 10%, significantly lower than the sort of 25% everyone else got, and a deal on steel as well. So it pays a lower steel tariff than its competitors do.
So the EU, the Britain is in a much better position. And why do you think Britain has ended up in a better position? Is that because of good diplomacy? Is that just because the trade deficit is lower? What's guided that?
I don't want to take anything away from the work of UK trade officials, but I think part of it is just the unique situation the UK was in. As we said, there was no trade surplus to close, so they were facing the same 10% tariff that everybody else was, and therefore they didn't fight as hard to get rid of it, which made the conversation with the US easier. They were also uniquely exposed. The UK was uniquely exposed on cars and steel. The US is by far the UK's biggest market for its luxury cars, and UK steel was in some trouble as well and couldn't afford to lose the US market. So there are a lot of incentives for the UK to do a quick deal. But fundamentally, I mean, the UK has more agility, it has more freedom to do deals now and less weight to potentially get into a trade war brawl. So there were a lot of incentives to get a quick deal done, and it was able to do so.
Okay. And look, what do you think the effect of these tariffs are going to mean when Ursula von der Leyen says, look, right, we're going to hit back? What do you think that we could see happening from the EU?
I mean, the EU has a couple of options. The most symbolic kind of counterpunch is a very broad-based sort of flat tariff. And this the same sort of thing the US is hitting them with. The advantage of that is it's very easy for the public to understand. It's a clear demonstration of resistance to this kind of pressure. On the other hand, the downside of it is it's a blunt instrument. You raise costs on things that people really need. You raise costs on your own businesses. Their other option is to be a lot more targeted, to look at things like luxury US products like Kentucky bourbon and see if you can perhaps limit your retaliation to very strategically targeted sectors that can cause the Trump administration some political headaches, but which don't necessarily significantly increase costs of living for ordinary Europeans. So they have both of those two things, and there are sort of pluses and minuses to both of those approaches.
And look, Trump has also announced new tariffs on goods from Japan, South Korea, Canada, Brazil, and Mexico. Do you think that they will go ahead, or do you think there could be deals agreed to lower those tariffs?
One of the things that has made this so difficult for businesses who are trying to operate in this space is it really is impossible to predict because it is entirely up to Donald Trump.
Yeah.
There is no consistent framework that you can use looking at that list of countries. To begin with, some countries engage really constructively, some countries basically didn't engage at all. Some countries have a very large trade surplus. Some countries like Brazil have a deficit. There's no rhyme or reason to whether a deal will happen. So there is every chance that in some of these cases, they're able to sneak through a last-minute deal because of a good phone call between a national leader and Donald Trump, because something else falls into place. At the same time, you absolutely cannot bet on it. And no one really has a framework for telling you which ones are more likely and which ones aren't, because it is entirely within the capricious gift of the President of the United States.
And what do you think this is going to do for the sort of global economy, Dmitry?
I think the reaction from markets so far has been muted, in part because I think there is now skepticism that Donald Trump has the courage to roll out these tariffs and to maintain them. I think markets are factoring the idea that he will ultimately do a deal in a lot of these cases, or perhaps introduce the tariffs for a week or two and then back down. I don't necessarily think that that is the safe bet markets seem to. I think it is entirely possible that we see these tariffs introduced. But overall, I think the effect on the global economy will be more uncertainty, which means less investment, more conservative decision-making on the part of businesses about whether to hire, whether to expand, whether to take some risks, and whether to innovate. And all of that ultimately translates into higher inflation, lower value, lower wages, and just a drag on global economic growth.
Well, that's a cheery note on which to end. Dmitry, always good to catch up with you. Thank you very much for your time.